Welcome to a Did Nothing Wrong podcast remix. In episode 73, we talked with journalist David Niewert about his book, The Age of Insurrection, which covers the history of the so-called patriot anti-government movement from the late 1970s on up through the present day. We touch upon a lot of subjects in this episode that have taken on an increasing relevance as we approach Election Day, as well as some very old conspiracy theories that are now rising to the surface again in the aftermath of the disasters in Appalachia. Stick around.
This is a crusade. This is a holy war against the deep state.
Where are the dictators? Where are the strong men?
Donald Trump is our instrument for retribution.
I'm going to fight for Christians. I'm going to fight for white people.
They have the Great Reset. We have the Great Awakening.
And why shouldn't I root for Russia? Because I am.
I want to see these people go through misery because of their grooming against our children.
After the assailant entered the home asking, "Where's Nancy? Where's Nancy?" Those are the very same words used by the mob when they stormed the United States Capitol.
I did nothing wrong.
Today, we're joined once again by journalist David Niewert, whose new book is called The Age of Insurrection. The book follows the rise of the so-called patriot movement, from the migration of neo-Nazis to the Pacific Northwest in the late 1970s to the events of January 6th in Washington, D.C. We're honored to have him with us today. David, welcome back to Did Nothing Wrong. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me again, guys.
No problem. We really appreciate it.
Really excited.
This is going to be great. Your new book is called The Age of Insurrection, and it draws a pretty clear line between people like Richard Butler, the former head of the Aryan Nations, and what happened on January 6th. You were a reporter in northern Idaho in the 1970s and 1980s, and you witnessed the arrival of the Aryan Nations from their former base of operations in Southern California. What was the immediate effect on the area when these militants arrived?
Well, the first thing that actually we first noticed was that there was a sharp increase in hate crimes, attacks on Jewish businesses, attacks on mixed race couples and families, and, racist flyers being left all around. Yeah, and the criminality just got worse. And, it eventually culminated in 1984 in the Order and their multi-state rampage that included the assassination of a radio talk show host. Socially, it didn't seem to have a lot of an effect to the general public, but what we did see was over the years a very gradual demographic change in the state. Northern Idaho used to be the liberal half of the state, and not anymore.
No, definitely not. Yeah, and we've seen, it seems like, a recurrence of some of these people starting to move to northern Idaho again in the last few years. We've got guys like Vince James from Red Elephants, the guy who used to call himself Millennial Matt Colligan, lives in Post Falls now. So
yeah, Lana Lotcuff and her husband live there too.
Right. So they're trying to bring it back, it seems like.
Yeah. Oh, no, they're definitely following, following the footsteps of Richard Butler and Keith Gilbert, who actually lived in Post Falls when he was rampaging around in his swastika festooned Volkswagen thing there in Post Falls in the 80s. And Gilbert was quite a character. He had done time in San Quentin, 10 years for plotting to assassinate Martin Luther King in 1966. So yeah, after he got done with his prison time, he followed Richard Butler up to northern Idaho and took up residence in Post Falls. He actually inspired Idaho's very early hate crimes law, because he was the guy running around harassing mixed race school kids. But so yeah, we had this collection of people up there that changed things. But what actually happened was that they created this image of Idaho as a very white place for people who lived elsewhere. So beginning in the early 90s is when we really started seeing a flood of very hard right, arch conservative types moving up from Southern California primarily to northern Idaho and places like that. And I think the guy who kind of kicked it all off was Mark Furman, the cop in the O.J. Simpson case.
Right.
He moved to Sandpoint after fleeing LA in the wake of the Simpson trial. And next thing we knew, like every freaking retiring cop from Orange County was moving to somewhere in northern Idaho.
Yep, cashing out of LA and selling there. There was a wonderful photo I remember in the Spokesman Review of Mark Furman. Somebody caught him at the airport and tried to interview him, and the picture is basically Mark Furman with his fist up, looking like he's about to hit the reporter, and somebody took a picture of it, and that ended up running. It's just, it says something about who the people were that were moving up at that point.
Yeah. But once the trend got started, it really snowballed. I think in the last 10 years, especially, it's really snowballed. And this is something that had been going around. Actually, it well preceded the Aryan Nation's arrival in northern Idaho. There was a guy out in Michigan named Robert Miles who ran a neo-Nazi enclave there. He was the one who came up with what they called the Northwest Imperative, which was this idea that, let's get all the white supremacists and white people to move to northern Idaho and make it a white homeland. And the legacy is still with us.
Indeed.
I know you've talked about this before, but how a lot of people that moved there, a lot of people that you reported on and met with appeared to be normal. They looked normal, they acted normal, but they had these really extremist beliefs. And I know that's going back to when you first took on this beat decades ago. But you also mentioned in the book about people that are, I guess, fearing for expressing themselves politically in especially rural parts of the country, that, hey, if you have a Biden flag or sign, and people feel like they're under threat, and in many cases they are receiving threats. Has the landscape changed that much? Are they just past the point? Are some of these extremists past the point of hiding it because there's no point anymore? Or are they more aggressive? What do you think has led to that?
I think it's the latter. Well, so obviously they no longer feel the need to be discreet about it. Yeah, I think that this is the outcome of authoritarianism and authoritarian personalities at play. Authoritarian aggression is one of the three main traits, main behavioral clusters. There's authoritarian submission, which is submission to the glorious leader. Then there's authoritarian aggression, which is directed against anyone who fails to submit. And then conventionalism, this belief that they represent the real America, sort of thing. And those three behavioral clusters produce a whole series of traits, including openness to bigotry, if not outright participation, and an eagerness to embrace conspiracism, and also a belief that they're much more popular than they actually are. And so the aggression part is really a key thing, and it's being really inflamed right now. The aggression against liberalism, against anything that basically is failure to submit, is really intense right now, and it's really focused on the LGBTQ community currently. The whole groomer rhetoric thing, and the attacks on drag queen story hours and that sort of thing. And it tells you a lot that neo-Nazis, unrepentant neo-Nazis, are the ones showing up to protest these things now.
Yeah, the LGBTQ community has definitely been the focal point of much of the eliminationist rhetoric that's coming out of the far right now. And like you said, they're being labeled as groomers and targeted for abuse, harassment, and in a lot of cases now physical attacks. And you mentioned this in the book, but the language used by people like Ron DeSantis's Rapid Response Director, Christina Pushaw, to characterize LGBTQ people tends to echo QAnon rhetoric about saving the children. And how much of this do you think is an intentional choice that can be waved away when somebody decides to point out the resemblance?
Well, the problem is that it's hard to substantiate that there's actually a connection there, because honestly, they live in this big amorphous universe, this alternative universe of conspiracism and disinformation, and they bleed over into each other a lot. And so, there are a fair number of, I think, people I would call constitutionalists, patriot types, who don't necessarily buy into much of the QAnon stuff, especially the adrenochrome theories and things like that. But I would say a large majority of them are simpatico with them, with QAnon. But on the other hand, their focus isn't on, and they aren't necessarily motivated by the conspiracism in the way that, serious QAnon believers are. They're more motivated by paramilitary organizing. But the conspiracism undergirds their organizing and is part of their belief system. I mean, so someone like Christina Pushaw, she operates in this realm of extreme right. I call it descendant global right-wing takeover,
right.
And she's, she's part of that whole European disinformation, far-right organizing environment, including, Orban in Hungary. And so it really becomes hard to sort of parse it out, because they're all actually interconnected in ways that they support each other. It becomes part of the water they swim in. So, or swamp, if you were.
Somebody referred to it as the Fox News cinematic universe. And I think that, that's like a little past that now at this point, but I don't think that's the worst way to think about it.
Might be InfoWars cinematic universe.
Yeah, these are all parts of,
Might be a bigger influence from InfoWars, yeah. But you'll see the same attacks starting at Fox News and trickling on down to, Patriot Front. And the attacks on the LGBTQ community are a central part of their propaganda and the information they put out there. So it's they both rely on each other.
Right.
And where it starts and where it ends, who knows? But it is interesting to see just how prevalent this is. And I guess it makes us wonder how much these attacks on the trans community in particular are helping white nationalists recruit new members. Is this kind of something that's similar to what we saw in the 90s with white supremacists using, immigration as a gateway issue to get people drawn into the movement?
Yeah, very much. I mean, let's be clear. All of these recruitment techniques, in the 90s, gun control was the big issue. And then in the 2000s, it turned to immigration. And then since then, we've had, Antifa, critical race theory, groomers. I mean, all of these concocted enemies, right?
Right.
And part of the authoritarian right personality, the mindset is that they have to have enemies. They have to create enemies because they all want to be heroes. I mean, these guys all sit around and watch superhero movies and action movies that all are built on the hero mythos. And heroes can't exist without enemies. They have to have an enemy. So that's what they often said about doing, is creating enemies for the sake of making themselves heroic. And you'll never find, even the guys who go to malls and shoot up dozens of people see themselves as heroic, not to mention the guys, marching in Patriot Front uniforms and stuff like that. They're all creating a hero mythos for themselves, for the action movie of their lives and their minds,
So speaking a little bit about the hero dynamic, you've written a lot in this book and others about the incident in Boundary County, Idaho, at an area that later became known as Ruby Ridge, between Randy Weaver, who was a frequent visitor to the Aryan Nations compound, and the FBI that led to the deaths of Weaver's wife and son. This incident seems in a lot of ways to have been the flashpoint for what became known as this patriot movement that you talk about. Mm-hmm. It was the seed for a number of these groups that formed in the aftermath. And like you said, many of these people refer to themselves as patriots, but as you explain in the book, it's got a very different meaning for them. Can you elaborate a little bit on the difference between what we might normally think of as patriotism and what these people are all about?
Sure. Well, I mean, their adoption of the term patriot to name their movement, which happened in the 90s, actually came out of the original formulation was Christian patriots.
Right.
And these were that was the term of art for people who went to Aryan congresses. And as I mentioned in the book, these people seem fairly normal. They look like my neighbors that I grew up with, and until you talk to them for a while, and get into their beliefs, they seem reasonably normal. I mean, they're very, very conservative, but it's not until you start digging in that you find out that they're actually profoundly racist and bigoted. But for the most part, they fit into sort of the rural environment very well and very easily, because they look and talk and sound like most of us until you really get to know them. And so, by the 90s, when they started calling themselves the Patriot Movement and organizing militias, that whole strategy evolved from the Aryan nations, of a guy named Louis Beam, who came up with this idea of leaderless resistance as a way of fighting the back against the federal government. And this was actually inspired by the arrests of the order, the Aryan gang that I was mentioning, who killed the radio talk show host in '84. In the wake of that particular rampage, the federal government charged a bunch of white supremacists around the country who got money from the order from these bank robberies, charged them with sedition in Fort Smith, Arkansas. The prosecution failed. They were all acquitted. And but in the aftermath of that, some of the leaders of the Aryan nations and others, particularly this guy named Louis Beam, decided to take this other strategy, and it involved two components. One was to form small local action cells that had no direct attachment to the larger movement or the leadership of the larger movement. But those action cells would carry out the sort of paramilitary and terrorist acts that they envisioned, as well as, and then he also articulated a lone wolf strategy in which individuals would go out who also had no attachment to the movement or the organization or the leadership. And we've definitely seen both of those strategies unfold in the ensuing years. And the Patriot movement was basically a reflection of that first strategy of forming small militia cells. And that's why, they became known as the militia movement popularly, but they called themselves the Patriot movement. And they call themselves patriots in the same way that they call themselves constitutionalists. They take basically sort of very much an arch nationalist approach to everything, and completely pervert and basically rub out all the democratic components. That's certainly what the constitutionalists argue. They're the folks who do this reading of the Constitution such that it actually, they claim that the government shouldn't own federal land, shouldn't be running education, has no business doing anything other than running a military, basically.
Yep.
And they've been arguing, this actually grew out of the old, very racist posse comitatus movement. That was where a lot of these ideas originated, but they got filtered out and watered down. The overtly racist and anti-Semitic elements got erased in the 90s in the course of the militia movement bubbling up, because a lot of the purpose of the militia movement was to mainstream these far-right ideas in a way that was, sort of smuggling them into the mainstream discourse. And didn't really take off until 2008, 2009, with the rise of the Tea Party movement,
right?
Which is when we really saw patriot movement ideas being shuttled into the mainstream.
Yeah, you made an interesting point, which I thought was really important. I think you were talking about the constitutional sheriffs, but you mentioned that they are not anti-government. They are just anti-democratic. And I thought that was, if you want to expand on that, that'd be great. But it's just such a good point and a good thing to remember that they want to win. They want their form of government, not yours.
Yeah, they're fundamentally autocratic or authoritarian autocrats. Yeah, and they have no use for democracy. And that's pretty clear. But I mean, this was obvious when I used to, when I worked for the Southern Poverty Law Center, they'd fly me out there once a year, and I'd sit around and talk with my colleagues. And I was always arguing that, our standard term for the Patriot militia movement was they were an anti-government movement. And over the years, I just grew increasingly uncomfortable with that, partly because it became clear to me that these folks actually want a government. They just don't want a liberal democracy. So what they fundamentally are is an anti-democratic movement. And you know what? Most of them, and of course, they also object to being called anti-government for exactly that reason. Mm-hmm. I'm not against government. I'm just against this government.
Right.
Right. And that became really clear when they started talking about, electing Donald Trump. But also the hostility to democracy was also always latent because, it was, I think, best expressed by the adage that they often throw at you that this is not a democracy, it's a republic. It's a constitutional republic, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, this is utter rubbish. And that aphorism actually originated with the John Birch Society back in the early 1960s. It certainly has no basis in constitutional history or American history. So, but that's, and I think that reveals their hostility to democratic principles and institutions.
We even see it with somebody who's fairly mainstream in Charlie Kirk of TPUSA going out there and saying he's opposed to democracy. And of course he gets very upset if no, I just like yes, we're a republic, but a pure democracy is bad. But I know you've mentioned this before. It's just a way to continually assault and degrade our institutions, but it is very mainstream now. It is very common on the right.
Oh yeah, particularly if you go out to rural areas.
Oh yeah,
it's considered conventional wisdom out there.
You look at a guy like former Representative Matt Shea in Spokane, and this guy's not really running to be a representative in the current system. He wants to be like the warlord of whatever comes next. I think that guy's goal is to be the warlord of the redoubt, or however he's looking at this right now.
Yeah,
definitely see what you're saying about out in the more rural parts of, I live in Washington State. You don't have to get that far out of town to see people that have that sort of ethic and that sort of idea about where this should go next.
Yeah, just go to Monroe or Linden. You'll find them all over.
Oh, yes.
And of course, in Eastern Washington, it's even worse, which is where Shea lives. I saw Matt a couple of years ago at the Red Pill, speaking at the Red Pill Festival there in Montana, promoting COVID conspiracism and doing his thing. It was kind of interesting. The last time I wrote about him actually was last summer at the Pride in the Park event in Coeur d'Alene. A bunch of folks may remember that event was targeted by a group of neo-Nazis from the group Patriot Front, who showed up with 31 of them in a U-Haul van, planning to march into the park, but the Coeur d'Alene police caught them en route into town and arrested all 31 of them. Among those, and at the same time that was happening, there was also a counter event happening just down the block, being organized by Christian nationalists, some of whom were closely affiliated with Shea, and Shea himself was there. But spoke at the the anti-gay, anti-LGBTQ event. But and actually he led a march down the street towards the Pride in the Park event, and then they turned around. But it later turned out that two of the Patriot Front members who were arrested that day were actually the sons of Shea's right-hand man there in Spokane at his church.
Right. I remember
and
this.
Shea promptly turned around and threw them under the bus. And, well, he's no longer part of my inner circle, and the boys were never members of the church, and
of course,
they run as far as and fast as they can from this stuff.
Still think it's amazing that Matt Shea used to be a regular on InfoWars back in 2008 and 2009.
Yeah,
that just woo. It's a little scary.
Yeah. Well, I mean, no, that's their world. I mean, honestly, Alex Jones has probably done more damage to our information sphere and our public discourse than even Fox News, mainly because he's polluted it so profoundly. But Fox News's pollution is a more insidious kind because it spreads so easily, and it's so mainstream seeming. I mean, among folks on the far right, anything that's on Fox News, no matter how utter rubbish it is considered conventional wisdom pretty much by these folks. So.
Right. Well, speaking of conventional wisdom, they recently let a guy go by the name of Tucker Carlson over there at Fox News. And, nobody's really sad about that over here, but he was one of the strongest pushers of what these people call the Great Replacement theory.
Yeah.
Tucker really, really hammered that and telling people that the global elites are plotting to replace white populations demographically and culturally with non-white people. And this is an old trope, obviously, that the white nationalist movement have been pushing for years, but it's gained a lot of traction in the last decade of what passes for the mainstream of the Republican Party. So can you talk a little more about what they mean when they say Great Replacement?
The term Great Replacement comes from French book published in 2012 that had the same title, The Great Replacement. And it was basically this argument that the hoary belief in, the Jewish conspiracy, Jewish cabal that secretly runs the world is engaged in an effort to import as many non-white immigrants into, at that time, he was describing mostly Europe in the great original book. But of course, it got adopted ardently by American white nationalists who said the same thing about, non-white immigration into the United States. That basically the plot is to displace and replace white voters, white citizens with brown people who will be more compliant, right? As if that were the case.
Can't fault them for trying.
At any rate, they have been selling this, theory. And Tucker did it in an interesting way. He made it out to be a purely political thing, that this was something that Democrats were plotting to do as a way to get more Democratic voters and replace Republican voters, conservatives voters, with these non-white immigrants who would vote for them. Of course, contingent on that whole theory is the fact that it basically takes about 12 years at least for an immigrant to gain citizenship status in the U.S. So, I mean, that's a pretty long-term strategy.
It's the long game. Definitely the long game.
Well, and a lot of Latinos actually switched to Trump in 2020. So the idea that it's a guaranteed new voter block, they won't let Trump build his wall because they got to get new voters. Well, the data really isn't bearing that out. But you're right; it was a convenient smokescreen for him.
Well, and that's the thing, is that when Democrats do this stuff, as well as pushing for more voting by younger people and that sort of thing, they understand perfectly well that a lot of these voters, they push for expanding the voting base because they think it's more democratic. And of course, they think they'll probably benefit by doing that. But they understand automatically that there's no guarantee that these new voters that they're going to be getting out to the polls are necessarily going to be punching the ticket for them. But Republicans have such an authoritarian view of the world that they don't see things that way. They assume automatically that this is all kind of, work against them and work in favor of the Democrats. But,
the demon rats.
Demon rats. Yeah.
It is really tied to that conspiracism, though, because with the Great Replacement and what Tucker has put out there, I know I've seen the memes, the white nationalist neo-Nazi memes of the percentage of white population, by year, by decade, and they really instilled the fear in their voting bloc that you have to do something now. And unfortunately, we see that with mass shooters who feel compelled to act because, well, if we don't do something about the declining white birth rates now, well, then it's just going to be too late. And it's scary and it's terrible, but it has been a motivating factor for multiple mass shooters.
Yeah,
sure. Oh yeah, absolutely. And, and then you see it creeping up in Elon Musk's feed, and it's like, I think we're in trouble here, folks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we did talk about Tucker and, his recent job change, as it were, and we don't know exactly why he got fired still. We've got some reasons, but we don't know exactly why. And we do know that he, like you said in the book, is one of the primary sources of eliminationist and white nationalist rhetoric. And if you watch these guys talk, like, I've got clips of Vince James and guys like that talking about how Tucker can say the things they're not allowed to say. Tucker can somehow get this in front of more people.
Yeah, Fuentes says that too. A lot of white nationalists. And Andrew Anglin, just loves Tucker Carlson. So
So he's not on cable anymore. They're going to have to switch over to Twitter to watch this guy if they want to. And what impact do you think that's going to have on their movement, having Tucker completely off mainstream TV, as it were?
Honestly, I think that this is one of those cases where deplatforming actually works. I think it's going to have a much smaller audience. I mean, that was the problem with having him on Fox News, is that it was just a fire hose of disinformation and bigotry. And at least we've slowed it to just a regular hose, or at least it will be. And I don't think, I think that he's going to have trouble certainly getting back that audience. What was he getting, like 13 million a night, something like that?
He was the number one rated news show on TV.
And now it's bad when I think the first night he put a show out, he had to send an email out to explain to people how to get to his video on Twitter. And how many people actually are going to do that, understand it, if with the older audience especially. I mean, it's hard. And when you make it harder, some people just don't go to the trouble.
Well, and it's not like actually Tucker won that audience by virtue of his sparkling personality. He won it by virtue of being on Fox News in prime time, and he won it by saying, spreading the kind of propaganda and disinformation that his audience actually expected of him. I mean, this is one of the things we've certainly learned since January 6th, is that in a lot of ways, the authoritarian tendencies of the Fox audience and the right-wing audience is actually steering the discourse as much as the people at the top are now. They're really, in many ways, no longer in control. Yeah, Trump tried to trot out, his defense of the vaccines, and he ran into so much resistance, he just had to abandon it, because he realized that this was not popular with his base,
right? That
his base had been subsumed by the anti-vax theories, and so he better just shut up. And think about Fox made a brief stab around the elections of 2020 at return to credibility by calling Arizona for Biden,
right,
which brought down the hordes of angry Trumpists on the heads of the network, and a lot of people got forced out. And so by early January, after the insurrection, a lot of those Fox corporate heads were gone. The people who had made the call in Arizona, because they realized that they that basically the audience was controlling their message as much as anything. And yeah, so they've created this beast and they barely know how to ride it.
Definitely.
Yeah, unfortunately, all the memes about how great the vaccine was and how great a job Trump was doing, it did not make for great content. And unfortunately, a lot of this movement, it rolls on. It is conspiratorial. Of course, they ended up saying, oh, the vaccine is bad. But I think also part of it is people turn on it because, hey, this isn't a good show. My audience doesn't want me to say the government did a good job, which is concerning.
The spread of extremism and the growth of extremism and the sort of the extreme parts of extremism are in many ways. I was thinking about Glenn Beck back in 2009 and 2010. There's this zone of the media that believes that your audience size is everything, and that anything goes in terms of attracting the audience. And the number one route to attract that audience is to say crazy shit that is going to make everybody go nuts. So that was certainly a shtick that Glenn Beck perfected. It was also, before that, Rush Limbaugh had perfected it. And, the whole idea, the ethos of constantly pushing the envelope means that you inevitably have to start adopting ideas from the white supremacist movement and from the real extremes of the right.
Right.
And that's exactly what's happened.
Yeah, I know you've mentioned that before, that at least 60s, 70s, maybe into the 80s, that the Republican Party made a point of not taking common cause with neo-Nazis and the Klan and these groups because they knew these are the bad guys and they're not for us either. And that line is now gone.
Yeah.
Gone. Absolutely gone. Yeah. That understanding has vanished. Yeah. As I mentioned, Keith Gilbert, the neo-Nazi who had the Volkswagen thing in Post Falls, he was responsible for for Idaho passing one of the first hate crimes laws back in 1982, because he not only was threatening these mixed race families in Coeur d'Alene and Post Falls, but when the Kootenai County prosecutor came up with, this idea of the malicious harassment law that eventually became law, and legislators promoted it in the legislature, it was looking like it was going to fail because their conservative Republicans weren't eager to jump on board. And then Gilbert made a threat, a public threat to that any Republican legislator who voted for this law was going to be facing his wrath. And it turned into this, tide of votes in favor of the law. So thank you, Keith. Good service rendered.
They've always been so amazingly foresightful and tactical.
I grew up Republican, and I'm from Idaho, and what's happened to the Republican Party since I was a kid has just been appalling.
I understand that as someone in deep red Tennessee, and my grandfather listened to Rush Limbaugh every day. Every time he was in the car, took me anywhere, Rush is on. You go in the house, Fox News is on. They would mute it sometimes, but they didn't even turn it off. It was just on all day. And yeah, I know for me, I really wanted to believe that Republicans would come back from the brink. I live around Republicans. Everyone in my family is a Republican. I thought, and then they said, well, Trump is, I don't love him, but he's just kind of an outlier. We're just having a moment. It'll get better. Sanity will return. And then the opposite has happened, which it's hard to not get down and depressed by that, but you have to kind of take that energy and put it somewhere more positive, because the threat is still out there and it's growing. And this book really encapsulates all of it, which is why it's such a valuable resource. And we enjoyed it so much. So I'm so glad that we got to talk to you about this. I actually did notice that you went on the Lincoln Project, though, and you talked about wanting to write a book about how we get out of this. What are our next steps to move forward? And are you feeling, it's been, I guess, a couple months since you said that. Are you still feeling like that's possible? And like you have an outline in your head of what the next steps are? Or are you still working through that?
Oh, I'm still working through it. I mean, no, I don't have an outline. I think I'm going to write a book about humpback whales next. While I contemplate how we get out of this, because it is intractable. I mean, just what you mentioned. We all have family and friends who've all gone down these rabbit holes, who've all been captured by this authoritarian movement and are, I keep telling people that authoritarianism is a hell of a drug. If people get addicted to it, it's just like, you got to have your TV on all the time on these authoritarian channels, and you have to be having this stuff being fed in over your radio all the time as well. Just every component of their lives gets consumed by these authoritarian beliefs. The Republican Party, I still believe that, there's a valuable place in our political discourse and for our political healthy body politic for a genuinely conservative politics, what's happened to the right now is not conservative, rather the opposite. It's extremism, it's radicalism.
Right.
It's the opposite of conservatism. It's become a travesty of conservatism. And how do we repair that? How do we pull people out of these rabbit holes? How do we draw people back? And ultimately, I've experienced, I've gone through all the various different iterations over parts of my career. I've certainly seen how fruitless it is to try to pretend them away and hope that things just get better. Because that ain't going to happen, folks.
Right.
These are people are trying to destroy our democracy, and you better fight for it, or else we're going to lose it. And that ultimately is, I think, where we have to draw the line. That we, instead of trying to play nice, be like Dick Durbin in Illinois, where you constantly are accommodating these guys. I think that Democrats need to learn how to play hardball. I think they need to get some spine and show that they are ready, not only ready and eager and willing, but capable of defending democracy. And I thought the 22 results were pretty promising that way, because what we saw in that election was that voters supported people who campaigned on saving democracy.
Yeah,
and I think we need to lean into that really hard. I think we need to be, like I said, I think we need to play hardball. I think we need to quit playing dilly-dally games and assuming that the other side is operating in good faith, because they're not. In fact, the Republican Party has essentially established that they are really no longer viable partners in the power sharing agreement that we've had since the 1930s.
No.
And because they are openly hostile to democracy. And I think we just need to come to terms with that. It's not that we need to make the people who fall into these beliefs our enemies, but I think it is important to understand that they're terribly mistaken, terribly misled. And, there's always hope for redemption. I think people can be redeemed, and I think we should try to work towards that. But first, we need to defend our democracy.
It's interesting, like talking about what you said about 2022 and the candidates that talked about defending democracy having a lot of success electorally. The center-right conventional wisdom right before that election was that no one cared about that. You shouldn't talk that much about January 6th because that doesn't resonate.
Gas prices.
Right. That doesn't resonate with us. And it was very fascinating to watch that all get completely repudiated at the ballot box when that came up. Like, gee, nice of you to try and help us. Nice of you to really try and give us some good advice there.
Well, they said the same thing about abortion rights. And again, that's not what the polls said. But
no,
the centrist wisdom is kind of going out the window. And I am heartened that the left liberals are starting to see this. Do you see the shift in awareness of people more, traditionally in the center that are at least acknowledging the threat?
Yeah, I think when you have David Frum and David Brooks acknowledging the threat, it's a step forward, although they still want an namby-pamby response, even though they recognize the threat. I mean, honestly, that's the way it's been inside the Beltway for decades, that they create this bubble around themselves and they have really no clear sense of what people out in the rest of the country really think and feel, and what the sensibility really is. And not only that, I mean, one of the aspects of that is that sort of centrism, that hand-wringing centrism, is also a lot of the reason that liberal Democrats have a reputation for fecklessness and spinelessness, which is one of the reasons, it's one of the reasons the conservatives hate them, and one of the things that they make fun of them for is for their spinelessness and fecklessness. And then they turn around and actually, well, yes, we are feckless and spineless, but we want to have everything better.
And you're just not going to get there with one side like that. You're just not.
No, it's totally asymmetrical. And it's, they believe that symmetry that existed for many years is still intact. And I'm here to tell you, it ain't.
No.
It's been asymmetrical for at least 20 years.
Well, and they're convinced, I think a lot of people in DC are convinced that these ideas, this Christian nationalism and QAnon and the anti-vax stuff, it's still fringe. It's always been there. It's always been a problem. This is no different than it's been for decades. But your perspective is so great because you do speak to people in rural areas and you do talk to these people. You know what they believe. I think you would readily dispute that characterization.
Well, mostly it's just that honestly, the numbers of participants in these movements has just swollen to levels we've never seen. I mean, this stuff has actually been around for a long time and mostly existed on the fringe, but it's no longer on the fringe. It has gotten into the mainstream, and the numbers of people that are participating, that are showing up to listen to Vincent James Fox talk on his YouTube show, to tune in to Nicholas Fuentes and his America First show, and all the others. Is just, there is really large audiences that we're seeing, and also significant participation in online chats and on Twitter and other social media. It's not a fringe movement anymore. And that's the point, is that, no, this stuff's been mainstreamed, and it's been mainstreamed by a lot of different forces that are actually eager to tear down and hollow out our democratic institutions.
One thing that you also mention a lot in your book is that this thing has gone kinetic in local areas around the country, that a lot of school boards have been targeted by these people. And you do mention that a lot of it's being done through almost an AstroTurf type of campaign. They bring in people from outside the district to disrupt school board meetings. They don't necessarily have kids in school, but it doesn't matter because they're there and they're loud and they're intimidating. And we're seeing school board members in a lot of places just quit because they don't want to have to deal with the potential for violence, the potential for doxing. Nobody really wants to be the target of this campaign. That's not what you signed up for. But these people, of course, don't have a personal stake in what's going on. So for them, it's show up and harass people. Can you explain why they're taking this approach and what kind of success they're having with this?
This approach actually evolved immediately after January 6th, when and mostly a lot of it came out of the Proud Boys, who realized that, they weren't going to be able to enjoy that sort of mega relationship that they had with Trump anymore. And that their future strategy, the future for them lay in building up local chapters and having those chapters be very active. But it came down to the idea that the way forward after January 6th involved becoming much more diffuse and spreading out into local entities, and attacking as you say, school boards, but also library boards and librarians attacking health boards and health districts, and then city councils and county commissions, county planning commissions, that sort of thing, as well as ultimately state legislatures as well. And basically, sort of, let's go diffuse and let's gain ground. We can gain ground by focusing on local recruitment, building up our organization sort of from the ground up, and spreading over and taking over these local entities. I mean, not far from where we live is the town of Sequim, which briefly was taken over by a QAnon city council. And it was, it was creating all kinds of dysfunction. This is a coastal town not far from Port Angeles. It's full of retirees.
Beautiful place.
Yeah, and on the Olympic Peninsula. Interestingly, and it was in addition to showing us, the problem of how this localized strategy is going to look going forward. It also, the ultimate outcome of that situation also points us to, I think, the direction that I think works, which is directly confronting them, playing hardball, leaning into defending democracy. Because what happened was local residents organized their own slate of candidates to replace these guys, and they voted them out in the next election. And that's how you win. Ultimately, it comes down to having an awareness that your community is under attack,
right.
Having an awareness that these forces are aligned against it. And so in a lot of ways, that's the purpose of this book, is to try to help people understand the nature of the forces that are arrayed against our democracy, as well as what their strategies and tactics are, so we can recognize them and stand up to blunt them. But ultimately, I'm also trying to make the case that that's how we defend democracy, is that we actually just do the work of democracy itself and stand up and defend it.
I think it's something that you pointed to a lot in the book, and that resonated with me, is the need that the right has for fear. It is totally understandable for all of us to be concerned. If you're a school board member, if you're just someone who wants to go grocery shopping, and the thought in the back of your mind about a shooter is there. I don't think that's crazy. I think it's entirely understandable in this climate. But you mentioned this, and we see this, that it's okay to feel the fear. It's reasonable to be concerned and to be wrestling with this, but you also have to understand that these people need you to be afraid, and they are working very hard to instill fear in us, which is something that we have to, again, be aware of, but not let it paralyze us, not let it prevent us from taking action, because it is easy to just throw our hands up in the air and think, well, I just won't go anywhere. I just won't do anything. But more and more people are standing up and realizing that while the threat is there, together we can fight back. We are not powerless. We are not helpless. And I hope that everyone listening keeps that in mind when they read your book, when they hear us, when they think about this. There is hope, and we have to remember that.
Yeah. I mean, of course, part of this is just the way I'm personally wired. When someone tries to make me fearful, I'm very pugnacious, and I get into a fight response. So, I'm not someone who is willingly intimidated. So, but I understand people who are, and especially people who have families and lives that they want to protect and things like that. But if we don't do this, if we don't take the stand that I think we need to take in the next decade to counteract this movement, this tide of authoritarianism, then I think that we will be living under an authoritarian state eventually. And then all those things that that you're afraid of will actually come true.
Right.
Yeah.
One thing that I did want to talk to you a little bit about is that You brought up the Fort Smith case in Arkansas in 1987, and that the government was unable to secure convictions for any of these guys for seditious conspiracy. Well, recently, as we saw, the government did a little better on that when they brought up the leaders of the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys and managed to convict quite a few of them of seditious conspiracy, including Stuart Rhodes, who just caught a very long prison term. You mentioned that after January 6th, they had a surge of people that were interested in joining the group, especially a lot of law enforcement types. But how much are these convictions of Stuart Rhodes and the rest going to hurt them? Do they have some leadership waiting in the wings that can go ahead and take advantage of this?
I think Oath Keepers are probably dead as an entity. I think they're crumbling as we speak, and I don't think that they have much traction anymore. In the Patriot movement, who's going to replace them is the 3%ers. That entity is still very much viable. They didn't catch a lot of attention. I don't think they caught there are some 3%ers who are also Oath Keepers who have been convicted, but 3% movements escaped a lot of scrutiny in all this. So I would guess that, we're definitely going to continue to see Patriot paramilitary organizing and the Patriots spreading their conspiracist worldview as well, mostly through outfits like the 3%ers. Proud Boys are a totally different story. They're still very much viable, mainly because they went they went to this localized strategy.
Right.
And also, I don't think that they were as contingent or dependent on their national leadership as the Oath Keepers were. Oath Keepers were pretty much Stuart Rhodes was really central to that organization's vitality. And with him in prison, I don't think they're going to be vital at all. Whereas the Proud Boys, they got Ethan Nordine and Joe Biggs and those guys, and Enrique Terrio, those guys are all behind bars now. But their leadership was much more diffuse, and their appeal, I think, particularly to 21st century males, is actually much broader and deeper than the appeal of militiamen. Militia concept is to. I think it's a generational difference, to tell you the truth.
No, agreed, definitely. That's
men in their 20s and 30s are still looking at the Proud Boys, and they have energy that matches up really well with what they're doing right now.
Yeah, they appeal to the toxic masculinity crowd. That's their whole deal.
Yeah. So, how's the response been to the book so far? What are you hearing? People that are...
Well, actually, the only response I've gotten so far is from, folks like Library Journal and Kirkus, who all have given it a thumbs up. Library Journal says every American should read it. And I go, yeah, I agree. But so, yeah, I mean, it's the early stages. I'm sure that there will be some pushback at some point. Especially, I've got a couple chapters that are probably going to be pretty controversial. The chapter in which I pretty much defend Antifa or anti-fascists as, the supposed threat that they pose that's been built up over the past 5 years is basically a phantasm.
Right.
Well, for us personally, that's something that we watched and witnessed online as it happened, as the right tried to make Antifa a thing, when it was very much like just kind of a tiny little speck on the map of people that called themselves Antifa and were out organizing in any sort of fashion. But the right needed an enemy. And a lot of that astroturfing was done online. I know even early on we had, like with Patriot Prayer and Joey Gibson's group, that some of them were dressing up as Antifa and then fighting the other white nationalists because they needed someone to go fight. And
then you take November 4th, 2017, when it was all supposed to be this big, civil war, and they couldn't really get Antifa. The best they could do was a, old Maoist communist group from back in the day with Bob Avakian calling itself Refuse Fascism and trying to get out there in the streets.
Yeah, that was what they built it out of, those first there was the inauguration night, supposed communist takeover led by refused fascism, and then the November one where they took a joke tweet where somebody said, "Yes, I can hardly wait till I could start killing Christian children and their parents," sort of thing.
Yep.
Obviously, a satirical take, and they took that seriously. That the Gateway pundit said, "Oh, Antifa planning to kill American parents,"
The whole super soldiers thing.
But yeah, it's also, remember that was really critical to the failure of the attempted coup on January 6th, was the fact that they had built this phantasm out of whole cloth, more or less. And so when they planned January 6th, I mean, they believed their own bullshit about that stuff, right? So they believed that when they turned up in D.C. on January 6th, that the Antifa would be there to fight them on the steps of the Capitol, and that would provide Trump the pretext for declaring martial law or invoking the Insurrection Act. So it actually failed, because when they actually showed up on the steps, Antifa wasn't even there. Right. And all that was left was the Capitol Police, so they plowed them over instead. So that was really critical, the fact that it was a phantasm. But I remember in the summer of 2020, and we still hear from Republicans, "Well, burned down all these American cities, and Antifa." And,
right.
And Antifa had nothing to do with the George Floyd protests. That was Black Lives Matter and people who were organizing against racist police enforcement. That was who was out in the streets that summer. It wasn't Antifa folks. But they still have this thing in their head.
They can't seem to separate it. I mean, they blur the lines so much with Antifa and BLM and communism and all this that it just becomes like one amorphous blob of things they hate. And yeah, there are distinct groups out there. It's crazy, but it's actually a thing.
Yeah. And so the other chapter that I think is probably could be controversial is the one where I discuss police.
Right.
And how we do have a real police problem. And partly because I think one of the things that people who complacently believe that democracy will just defend itself is that they're actually depending on police forces to stand as sort of the line of defense against white supremacist violence. And the behavior of police in the last 10 years has told me that that's not a reliable defense. We've had way too many forces infiltrated by right-wing extremists, and we have had way too much behavior, as we saw in Seattle and Portland and San Francisco, by the police, essentially sympathetic to the Proud Boys and the white nationalists, and letting them more or less, basically defending them against the citizens of their own cities.
Right.
That was the thing that bothered me about the Portland stuff, is that these guys were clearly bussing in bigoted thugs from ex-urban and rural areas. They'd all gather, and when it was in Portland, they'd all get on the bus in Vancouver, come over the bridge, and come into downtown Portland. And they were attacking people who lived in the cities, right? The protesters, who mostly anti-fascist later on, but not initially, protesters who turned out to contest them were all people from Portland. And normally, certainly traditionally, your police forces are actually supposed to defend the communities against these kinds of depredations from violent outsiders, which is what these guys were. But instead, we saw the police, many of whom actually don't even live in the cities themselves, actively intervening and assisting these violent thugs. And that was very concerning to me. And I think that we need to, there needs to be a wholesale cleaning house of law enforcement in America before I think our democracy is going to be secure again.
Yeah, we absolutely have some room to improve when it comes to policing in this country in a lot of ways, and that's definitely one of them. We should really think hard about where this is going in the future, and how do we get rid of the people who want to make common cause with guys like, Patriot Prayer, what we saw in Portland. And this is a problem. This is definitely a problem. We saw it, you're right, in Seattle as well. it seems like we're having such a hard time recruiting officers, anybody who actually wants to do the job, that we're taking people who shouldn't necessarily be anywhere near a badge and letting them go out and do this, at which point you're going to get what you hired. And it's not good.
Well, the line of work naturally attracts authoritarian personalities.
Right.
But when you combine them with these very politicized right-wing police unions and put them in that environment, it just gets on steroids.
Yeah.
And they become control freaks. And it's really a problem. Probably more so in Portland than in Seattle, but it's still a problem regionally. And really, from my observation, I think it's probably true, probably every city in the country. Definitely true in New York.
Yeah.
They have a real problem with authoritarian cops there.
Well, David, thank you so much for coming on with us. This has been really enlightening. I'm glad that we got a chance to sit down with you and talk about this. Again, the book is called The Age of Insurrection, and like Library Journal said, every American should own a copy. We would endorse that view, definitely.
Yeah, 100%.
Or at least check it out from your library.
Absolutely. It's great stuff, folks. You got to read it.
Yeah, it'll catch you up on everything that's happened in far-right extremism, at least in the last few years. It is a great resource, and we're so glad that we got to do this with you.
Definitely.
Yeah. My idea was that I think a lot of the response, the books that have come out afterwards have been kind of piecemeal. They attack specific components of it or discuss, and some of it's very good. I really like Andy Campbell's book on the Proud Boys, for instance. Tip my hat in his direction. But at the same time, my idea was that, look, we need a book that lays out the whole picture. That gives everybody the broad spectrum as well as the history. And so that was what I set out to do. And it did wind up being a long sucker, but I think it's hopefully it's a good beach read this summer.
Definitely a good beach read. Thank you so much, David. We really appreciate your time today. You have a great rest of your day, okay?
All right. Thanks for talking, guys.
No problem.
Thanks
Take
again.
care. Thanks for listening to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast. If you want to hear more, you can find us on the web at didnothingwrongpod.com. Please make sure you subscribe to get our content straight into your inbox. You can also follow us on Twitter at GrizaBJJ, GRZABJJ, as well as DNWPod. We're extremely grateful for paid subscriptions and donations that allow us to keep doing this important work. Thanks, and remember, everyone mentioned did nothing wrong.